History is almost always taught to us as the spectacle of explosions. We are trained, from childhood, to believe that empires die loudly, that their end is marked by a single dramatic moment, a city in flames, an army breaching the gates, a flag being torn down while the crowd watches in shock. Rome falls to barbarians. Berlin collapses under bombs. Paris trembles as the guillotine drops. We are taught to look for the bang. But this version of history is a lie. It is not an innocent mistake. It is a theatrical illusion, one that keeps you staring at the horizon, waiting for an invading army that will never come, while you ignore the termites silently eating the floorboards beneath your feet. Because the truth is deeply uncomfortable. Most empires do not die by murder. They die by suicide. And more precisely, they die because the people who designed the empire, its architects, its financiers, its ruling class, decide that the structure is no longer worth maintaining. They begin dismantling it piece by piece, selling the bricks, stripping the copper wiring from the walls, and extracting whatever value remains before the roof finally collapses. By the time the average citizen realizes what is happening, the exit has already occurred. We are told that we are currently witnessing the decline of the American empire. But if you are waiting for a sudden crash, a single day when the stock market goes to zero, the dollar becomes worthless, and chaos erupts overnight, you are looking for the wrong pattern. You are looking for the Roman pattern. What you should be looking for is the Dutch pattern. In the 18th century, the Dutch Republic was not just powerful, it was untouchable. It possessed a global reserve currency. It commanded the most sophisticated financial system on earth. It controlled the seas with a dominant navy and enjoyed the highest standard of living humanity had ever recorded at that time. It was, by every meaningful metric, the envy of the world, and yet, over the course of roughly 50 years, the Dutch quietly, methodically, and almost invisibly ceased to be a superpower. There was no catastrophic invasion that burned Amsterdam to the ground. There was no plague that wiped out its population. There was no singular military defeat that ended everything overnight. Instead, something far more dangerous happened. The Dutch elite, the merchants, bankers, and politicians who controlled capital and policy, came to a realization. They recognized that the empire had reached its limits, that growth at home was slowing, that maintaining global dominance was becoming more expensive than it was profitable, and so they made a rational decision, rational for them, catastrophic for everyone else. They chose to exit. They exported their wealth. They lent their capital to their rivals. They detached their personal fortunes from the fate of their own nation. The empire did not collapse first. The loyalty collapsed first. To understand what is happening in the United States today, why stock markets reach all-time highs, while bridges rust, infrastructure decays, and the middle class evaporates, we must go back to Amsterdam, circa 1780, because the parallels are not merely interesting, they are terrifying. The Dutch pattern is not a historical curiosity, it is a blueprint, a step-by-step guide showing how a hegemonic power hollows itself out from within, how a nation of producers transforms into a nation of speculators, and how a ruling class quietly separates its destiny from the destiny of its people, and once that separation is complete, the fall becomes inevitable. To understand how the Dutch Empire fell, we must first understand why it rose, because empires do not emerge from clever accounting or financial tricks. They emerge from production, from the ability to take raw reality and reshape it into something the world needs. In the 1600s, the Dutch were not financiers first, they were builders, they were the workshop of the world. The Dutch did not dominate because they were lucky or because history favored them. They dominated because they solved practical problems better than anyone else alive. They engineered their way to power. They extracted wealth from nature through innovation, discipline, and relentless efficiency. They invented the industrial sawmill, a breakthrough that allowed them to process timber at a scale and speed no rival could match. They perfected ship design, most notably the flight, a vessel capable of carrying more cargo with fewer crew members. Reducing costs while increasing reach, they mastered wind energy, turning geography itself into a productive weapon. This was not financial alchemy, this was physical dominance. The Dutch imported raw timber, iron, and materials from across Europe. They transformed these inputs into finished ships, tools, machinery, and commercial goods, then exported them back to the world at a premium. Every step of the value chain passed through Dutch hands. As a result, productivity exploded. Amsterdam did not become the richest city on earth because it speculated better than others. It became the richest city because it produced more than others, because it added real value to the global economy, because its prosperity was anchored to physical output, not paper claims, and this distinction matters. The Dutch guilder did not become the world's reserve currency by decree. No army forced foreign merchants to use it. It became the reserve currency because everyone wanted Dutch goods, and therefore needed Dutch money. The currency was backed not by ideology, but by labor, by engineering, by infrastructure, by ships in the water and goods in motion. This is the foundational rule of empire that is almost always forgotten. Monetary power is downstream from productive power, but success carries a hidden cost. As the Dutch economy grew richer, wages rose, living standards improved dramatically. The Dutch worker was no longer desperate or hungry. He was comfortable, secure, accustomed to abundance, and slowly, quietly, competitiveness began to erode. It became more expensive to build ships in Amsterdam and in emerging rivals like England or France. Dutch labor demanded higher pay, regulations multiplied. The domestic market matured and saturated. Margins shrank. This is the moment every empire reaches. The moment where success itself becomes the obstacle. The Dutch were no longer the scrappy innovators fighting for survival. They were the inheritors of a fortune, managing an empire built by their fathers and grandfathers. And instead of asking how to renew the productive engine, the elite asked a different question, not, how do we make more? But, why should we bother making anything at all? This was the pivot point, the moment when the cancer did not just appear, but metastasized. The great merchant families, who controlled the Dutch East India Company and dominated the Bank of Amsterdam, began to run the numbers. And the numbers told an inconvenient truth: the return on investment from domestic production was falling. Factories were messy, workers were difficult, ships required maintenance. Innovation required risk, but lending money was clean, predictable, effortless, and so the Dutch elite began to turn away from the physical economy that had made them powerful, and toward the abstract economy that would ultimately hollow them out. This was the beginning of the end. This is the moment where decline becomes destiny. When historians describe the Dutch transition from industry to finance, they often use neutral language. They call it economic maturation. They describe it as a natural evolution, the inevitable path of a successful, developed nation. According to this story, once a country becomes wealthy enough, it simply moves up the value chain. But this framing hides the truth. What actually happened was not evolution, it was abdication. The Dutch elite did not transition because production had become obsolete. They transitioned because production had become inconvenient. The margins were thinner, the work was harder, the risks were higher, and there was an easier way to extract wealth. The great merchant families of Amsterdam sat around tables and examined their ledgers. They compared the returns from building ships, running factories, managing labor, and maintaining infrastructure against the returns from simply lending capital. The conclusion was unavoidable. Why tolerate strikes, accidents, and operational complexity when you could earn steady interest by lending money to foreign governments and corporations? Why struggle to remain competitive when you could profit from someone else's growth instead? This single question sealed the fate of the Dutch Empire, and so, gradually at first, The capital began to move. Investment shifted away from shipyards and workshops and into bonds, loans, and financial instruments. The Dutch stopped being the workshop of the world and became the banker of the world. Amsterdam transformed from a center of production into a center of speculation, on paper. This looked like progress. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange exploded in activity. Financial innovation flourished. The Dutch elite invented complex derivatives, futures contracts, and exotic instruments that allowed money to make money without ever touching the real economy. The numbers soared. But beneath the surface, something vital was dying. Shipyards closed one by one. Skilled engineers aged out of the workforce with no replacements trained behind them. Fishing fleets shrank. Industrial capacity atrophied. The middle class, the backbone of the Golden Age, began to fracture and hollow out, yet the elite felt richer than ever. This is one of the most dangerous illusions in economic history. When financial wealth grows even as physical capability decays, ledgers fill with profits, while docks sit empty, balance sheets shine while infrastructure rusts, and because the elite lived in a world of numbers, not machines, they failed to notice, or chose not to care. Capital had found a new host. Across the English Channel, Britain was rising. It was hungry, industrializing, ambitious. It wanted an empire, but it lacked the capital to build one at scale. The Dutch had that capital in abundance. And so began the ultimate betrayal. Dutch bankers began lending massive sums to the British state. They bought British government bonds. They invested heavily in the British East India Company, the direct competitor to their own national enterprise. They financed the expansion of the very navy that would eventually blockade Dutch ports and strangle the Dutch economy. At first glance, this seems irrational. Why would a nation fund its own replacement? But, from the perspective of the elite, it made perfect sense. A Dutch banker did not care which flag dominated the seas. He did not care whether the empire was Dutch or British. As long as the interest payments arrived on time, the identity of the empire was irrelevant. This is the core principle of the Dutch pattern. Capital has no fatherland. Loyalty to the nation was replaced by loyalty to return on investment. The Dutch elite did not physically flee Amsterdam. They stayed in their Grand Canal houses. They attended their balls. They wore their powdered wigs, but financially, they had already left. Their wealth was no longer tied to Dutch shipyards, Dutch workers, or Dutch sovereignty. It was safely parked in London, earning steady interests, protected by British law and British power. They had built lifeboats for themselves and drilled holes in the hull of the ship beneath everyone else. From this point forward, the empire's fate was sealed. What followed was not collapse, but decay, not drama, but erosion. And once an empire chooses finance over production, it enters a death spiral that history has never reversed. Once the Dutch elite completed their financial pivot, the fate of the Republic was no longer a question of if, but when, from the outside, the Netherlands still looked prosperous. Amsterdam's canals glittered, the townhouses remained immaculate, art flourished, trade continued to flow to the average citizen. Life appeared stable, even enviable. This illusion is critical to the Dutch pattern. Decline does not announce itself, it disguises itself as continuity. But, beneath this polished surface, the real engine of power was shutting down. The Dutch Republic was no longer generating strength from within, it was renting strength from abroad. Its financial elite had discovered that they could earn higher, safer returns by funding foreign expansion rather than maintaining domestic capacity. And Britain was the perfect recipient. Britain in the 18th century was everything the Dutch once had been: ambitious, aggressive, and relentlessly industrial. It had coal, labor, and political will. What it lacked was capital. The Dutch supplied it in enormous quantities. Dutch money financed British factories. Dutch money built British ships. Dutch money underwrote British wars. This was not accidental, it was systematic. By investing in British bonds and British corporations, Dutch financiers were effectively transferring the tools of empire, industry, logistics, and naval power to their rival. Each loan weakened the Netherlands and strengthened Britain. Each interest payment deepened the dependency, yet from the perspective of the elite, there was no contradiction. They had decoupled their personal survival from national survival. Their wealth no longer depended on Dutch productivity, Dutch workers, or Dutch infrastructure. If the Republic declined, they would remain rich. If Britain ascended, they would profit even more. This is the moment where a nation ceases to exist as a collective project. When those at the top no longer share the risks of those at the bottom, the social contract dissolves. The ruling class becomes a parasite class, extracting value while refusing responsibility. The consequences were swift and corrosive as capital flowed outward. The Dutch domestic economy stagnated, investment in infrastructure slowed, maintenance was deferred, shipyards fell silent. The skilled trades that had once defined the Republic withered away. Apprenticeships vanished, innovation stalled. Meanwhile, inequality surged. The wealthy retreated into gated cultural spaces, salons, clubs, and elite institutions insulated from the economic decay around them. Status, fashion, and social distinction became obsessions. This was the era of excess, extravagant wigs, ornate clothing, and elaborate rituals masking a profound loss of substance. The poor experienced a very different reality. Urban poverty exploded. Entire neighborhoods descended into squalor. Food insecurity rose. Riots broke out, but there was no solution because the resources needed to fix the problems had already been exported. The wealth that could have rebuilt the Republic was earning interests in London. This is a critical feature of imperial decline. By the time the crisis becomes visible to the masses, the capital required to solve it is already gone. The Dutch state attempted to paper over the decay by borrowing. It issued debt to maintain the illusion of strength, to keep the navy afloat, to provide minimal welfare, to service previous obligations, and once again, it borrowed primarily from its own wealthy citizens. This created a perverse incentive structure. The elite benefited from national weakness. Every additional bond issued was another guaranteed stream of income. The state's decline became a private revenue model. The suffering of the population was transformed into a financial asset. The Republic was no longer governed. It was being liquidated. And yet, remarkably, most people did not see it. They trusted the institutions that had always worked. They believed the Bank of Amsterdam was stable. They believed the empire was eternal. They believed that tomorrow would look like yesterday. History shows us what happened next. When the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War erupted in 1780, the illusion shattered. The Dutch Navy, once feared across the world, was revealed as a hollow shell. Its ships were outdated, its crews undertrained, its supply chains fragile. Britain crushed the Dutch with ease. Shortly thereafter, the unthinkable occurred. The Bank of Amsterdam, the symbol of global financial stability for nearly 2 centuries, admitted insolvency. It had secretly lent out its gold reserves to prop up failing institutions. The reserve was gone. Trust evaporated overnight. The Dutch Golden Age ended not with fire and blood, but with a default. A quiet, humiliating end, invisible until it was irreversible. Fast forward to the United States of America. What makes the Dutch pattern so unsettling is not that it happened once, but that it follows a recognizable sequence. And when we overlay that sequence onto modern American history, the alignment is almost exact. The United States had its own golden age of production. From the end of World War II to roughly the early 1970s, America was the undisputed workshop of the world. Its factories produced the steel, the automobiles, the machinery, the electronics, and the consumer goods that rebuilt the planet. American industry did not merely compete, it dominated. The dollar was not strong because it was printed by decree. It was strong because American factories were running at full capacity. The Bretton Woods system anchored global trade to the dollar precisely because the United States could deliver real goods at scale. American workers were productive, well-paid, and embedded in a thriving middle class. Infrastructure expanded, innovation flourished. This was the material foundation of American power. But just as in the Netherlands, success carried the seeds of its own decay. Wages rose, environmental and labor regulations increased. Other nations, first Europe and Japan, then later Asia, rebuilt and caught up. American manufacturing margins shrank, the work became harder, the profits became thinner, and once again, the elite asked the same fatal question the Dutch had asked centuries earlier: why produce when you can finance? Beginning in the 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s, the United States made a deliberate choice. Manufacturing was rebranded as dirty, inefficient, and outdated. Finance, services, and knowledge work were declared the future. Factories were dismantled, supply chains were globalized, production was outsourced. We were told this was progress. American workers were promised that offshoring would benefit them, that cheaper goods would compensate for lost wages, that new jobs would appear, that everyone would move up the value chain. But what was actually happening was a replication of the Dutch exit. The engine of value creation was being shut down and replaced with an engine of value extraction. Wall Street replaced Detroit. Derivatives replaced machinery. Speculation replaced production. On paper, the strategy looked brilliant. GDP continued to rise. Corporate profits exploded. Stock markets reached record highs. Financial innovation was celebrated as genius. Economists coined phrases like "the great moderation," claiming that modern finance had eliminated the boom and bust cycle. In reality, the country was burning its furniture to heat the house. The financialization of the American economy created enormous surpluses of capital at the top, just as it had in the Dutch Republic. But that capital could no longer be profitably invested at home. The factories were gone. Infrastructure offered low returns. Wages were suppressed. So the money did exactly what money always does. It left American capital flow outward into the global market. It funded the industrialization of China, Southeast Asia, and emerging economies. It built factories in Shenzhen and Ho Chi Minh City. It transferred technology, know-how, and logistical expertise, just as Dutch capital had funded the rise of Britain. American capital funded the rise of its own successor. The logic was brutally simple. Why pay an American worker $25 an hour when you can pay a Chinese worker $2 an hour and capture the spread? Why invest in domestic resilience when you can extract global arbitrage? This was not a conspiracy. It was a rational response to incentives. But rational behavior at the individual level can be catastrophic at the national level. The American elite detached their fortunes from the American nation. Today, if the U.S. economy contracts, global corporations do not fail. They have customers, assets, and revenue streams in dozens of countries. If the dollar weakens, multinational funds hedge their exposure. They survive. They adapt. The country does not, though. Dutch exit is no longer theoretical, it is operational. The elite remain physically present in New York and Washington, but their loyalty is to global capital flows, not to the land, the infrastructure, or the people of the United States. And once that detachment is complete, the outcome becomes a matter of time, not policy. The Dutch pattern is not merely an economic phenomenon, it is a social and psychological one. When an empire can no longer provide rising prosperity to the majority of its population, it must offer something else in its place. Stability without progress is not enough. People need meaning, distraction, or someone to blame. In the late 18th century, as the Dutch economy hollowed out, society began to fracture along predictable lines. The wealthy withdrew. They retreated into insulated worlds. Elite neighborhoods, exclusive social circles, and cultural institutions designed to separate them from the economic reality below. Their lives became increasingly detached from production and increasingly focused on status, image, and social competition. This was the era of extravagance, massive wigs, elaborate fashion, ornate rituals, endless gossip about court politics and personal scandals, a society obsessed with surface-level symbolism, all its foundation decayed beneath it. Historians often mock this period, but it was not decadence born of excess, it was decadence born of decline. The poor experienced the opposite trajectory. As capital fled the domestic economy, employment opportunities vanished, urban poverty intensified, slums expanded, crime rose, food insecurity became common, riots erupted with increasing frequency, driven not by ideology, but by desperation. And yet, no structural solution ever arrived. Why? Because the resources required to solve the problem were no longer available. They had been exported. They were earning interest abroad. The state could only respond by borrowing, postponing the crisis rather than resolving it. This pattern repeats almost perfectly in the modern United States as real wages stagnated and manufacturing collapsed. American society did not respond with a renewed investment in production or infrastructure. Instead, it fractured culturally. Politics became theatrical. Media became sensational. Identity replaced economics as the primary battlefield. This was not accidental. When elites can no longer offer prosperity, they offer spectacle. They flood the public sphere with cultural conflict, endless debates over symbols, language, and identity, while the economic foundation continues to rot. People are encouraged to fight one another horizontally so they do not look upward vertically. The result is paralysis. Infrastructure decays in plain sight, bridges rust, power grids fail, water systems collapse, but these failures are treated as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of systemic capital flight. Meanwhile, inequality explodes. The wealthy accumulate assets at unprecedented rates, while the middle class erodes and the poor sink deeper into precarity. The social contract, the implicit agreement that effort will be rewarded, dissolves. This produces a dangerous psychological shift. When work no longer pays, people stop working. When speculation pays, people start gambling. In the late Dutch Republic, the ambition of a young man was no longer to be an inventor, an explorer, or a builder. It was to become a rentier, someone who lived off the interest of government bonds. Today, the American equivalent is the influencer, the day trader, the crypto speculator, the passive income seeker. This is not a moral failure, it is an adaptive response to incentives. A nation of gamblers cannot compete with a nation of builders, while declining societies obsess over asset prices and financial returns. Rising societies pour concrete, mine resources, and train engineers. This is why the shift in global power feels inevitable. The tragedy is not that people fail to see the decline, it is that they are distracted while it unfolds. The circus is loud, the rot is quiet, and by the time the distractions fade, the damage is already done. When elites lose faith in the state, they do not protest, they exit. This is one of the most consistent patterns in the collapse of empires. The ruling class always leaves first, not physically at first, but financially and legally. Their wealth detaches from the national system long before the population realizes what is happening. In the final phase of the Dutch Republic, capital quiet moved abroad. Wealthy families purchased land in England, France, and Germany. They held foreign bonds. They diversified legal jurisdictions. The Dutch state remained, but its elites were no longer economically dependent on its survival. This was the true end. An empire can survive corruption. It can survive inequality. It cannot survive elite abandonment. The modern American version of this process is unfolding in real time. Today's elite exit does not require ships or foreign estates, it requires lawyers, shell companies, and digital assets. Wealth is restructured into forms that are portable, opaque, and insulated from domestic instability. Real assets first, prime real estate in global cities, farmland, water rights, energy infrastructure. These assets do not depend on fiat credibility, they generate rents regardless of currency regime or political leadership. Then financial escape, offshore structures, trusts, foundations, jurisdictions designed to minimize exposure to domestic taxation and regulation. Wealth becomes stateless, loyalty dissolves, and finally, technological exit. Crypto is not about decentralization, it is about exit velocity. For elites, digital assets represent a parallel financial system, one that can bypass capital controls, evade inflationary erosion, and move instantly across borders. Whether crypto succeeds or fails as money is irrelevant. Its function as an exit option is what matters. This is the foundation of what can only be described as techno-feudalism. Power no longer flows through democratic institutions or nation-states. It flows through platforms, protocols, and private legal regimes. Corporations become quasi-sovereign entities. Arbitration replaces courts. Terms of service replace constitutions. Citizens become users. Workers become contractors. Rights become subscriptions. The state, burdened by debt and stripped of capital, loses enforcement capacity. It can no longer compel compliance from those with resources. Laws still exist, but they apply unevenly, harshly to the immobile, lightly to the mobile. This mirrors the late Dutch period precisely. The Republic still had laws. It still had institutions, but its richest citizens operated beyond them. The state governed those who could not leave, and this creates the final fracture. Those without exit options become trapped inside a failing system. They bear the inflation, the taxes, the collapsing services. Those with exit options extract value without responsibility. At this stage, reform becomes nearly impossible. Any serious attempt to restore productive investment threatens the interests of the rentier class. Any attempt to tax capital triggers capital flight. The state is paralyzed by its own dependence on those it can no longer control. This is not conspiracy, it is structural inevitability, and once elite exit is complete, the only question left is timing, not whether decline continues, but how fast it accelerates. Historical decline does not announce itself with a single dramatic event, it reveals itself through patterns. The most dangerous moment is not the beginning of decline, but the moment when decline becomes irreversible, when the system loses the capacity to correct itself. This is the point of no return. When we place the late Dutch Republic alongside the modern United States, the similarities are no longer abstract, they are structural, measurable, and increasingly visible. First, capital allocation in the 18th century. Dutch capital overwhelmingly flowed into government, debt, and foreign securities. Domestic industry stagnated, innovation slowed, risk-taking vanished. In the United States today, capital behaves the same way. Vast pools of money chase treasury bonds, stock buybacks, derivatives, and speculative assets. Meanwhile, manufacturing investment lags, infrastructure decays, and productivity growth slows. The financial sector grows even as the real economy weakens. Capital no longer builds, it extracts. Second, military illusion. The Dutch Republic maintained the image of naval supremacy long after it had lost the capacity to defend its trade routes. The ships existed on paper, the reality was wrought. The United States faces a similar contradiction. It spends more on defense than the next several nations combine. Yet procurement is slow, maintenance is costly, and readiness declines. Wars are fought at astronomical expense with diminishing strategic returns. Power projection continues, but at rising marginal cost and falling effectiveness. Empire becomes expensive theater. Third, social fragmentation. Late Dutch society fractured along class lines. Elites insulated themselves. The middle class eroded. The poor radicalized. Modern America mirrors this perfectly. Income inequality reaches historic extremes. The middle class shrinks. Politics polarizes into spectacle, trust in institutions collapses, social cohesion dissolves, not because of ideology, but because economic security vanishes. Fourth, debt dependency. Dutch state debt reached levels that consumed the majority of public revenue in interest payments. The state existed to service its creditors. The U.S. federal budget increasingly resembles this structure. Interest costs grow faster than defense, education, or infrastructure spending. The government's primary function shifts from governance to debt maintenance, future obligations. Dwarf present capacity. At this stage, reform becomes mathematically implausible. Fifth, elite exit in both cases. Elites disengage from the national project. Dutch elites became international rentiers. American elites become globalized asset managers. Citizenship becomes optional. National loyalty becomes symbolic. This is the clearest warning sign. When those with the most to lose no longer believe in the system has already lost. So, is the point of no return? It is not a date. It is a condition. The point of no return occurs when capital flight becomes permanent debt, service crowds out productive investment, elites fully decouple from domestic outcomes, the state loses enforcement power over capital, reform threatens collapse. More than stagnation by these metrics. The Dutch Republic crossed the threshold in the 1770s. By these same metrics, the United States is uncomfortably close. The lesson of history is not that decline can be avoided forever, it is that denial accelerates it. Empires rarely fall the way movies portray them. There is no single invading army, no final, heroic battle, no clear moment when the flag comes down. Instead, empires collapse quietly through spreadsheets, contracts, and obligations that can no longer be honored. The Dutch Republic did not lose its empire to superior enemies. It lost it to arithmetic. The numbers stopped working. When interest payments consumed public revenue, when capital refused to invest domestically, when elites exited the national project, the outcome was sealed. Military defeats merely revealed what the balance sheets already knew. The United States is not unique, it is not cursed, it is following a path well worn by history. The illusion of permanent dominance is the most dangerous belief an empire can hold. Power is not a moral achievement, it is a temporary condition sustained by productive capacity, institutional trust, and rational capital allocation. When those pillars erode, no amount of ideology can save the system. This is why debates about culture, identity, and personality are ultimately distractions. Empires do not fall because people disagree, they fall because they can no longer pay for themselves. The uncomfortable truth is that decline is not caused by bad actors alone. It is caused by incentives. Rational individuals responding to a broken system will behave in ways that accelerate collapse, not because they want to, but because survival demands it. Rent-seeking replaces building. Speculation replaces innovation. Exit replaces reform. And once these behaviors dominate, recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult. Yet history also offers a final, sobering lesson. Collapse is not the end of civilization, it is a redistribution of power. As one empire hollows out, others rise, not because they are morally superior, but because they still invest in production, infrastructure, and human capital. The tragedy is not decline itself. The tragedy is misunderstanding it. Empires that recognize the warning signs early can slow the process, manage the transition, and preserve social stability. Empires that deny reality experience shock, chaos, and fragmentation. The Dutch Republic faded into a quiet secondary power. Britain inherited its financial systems. America inherited Britain's role, and now history is preparing the next transition. The ledger never lies. The only question is who is reading it, and who is still pretending not to see.